Dear colleagues and partners, welcome to the first webinar this year of the TurboClick webinar series. TurboClick is a cross-sectoral group, Transformation, Urban Opportunities, Climate Change. And the webinar series aims to exchange experiences and good practices among our members as well as other interested colleagues. Today we'll be speaking about implementing the international agendas in and with cities. So beforehand, you already got some of interesting materials. We will also share the presentation afterwards and also the list of participants. So today we'll speak about implementing the international agendas in and with cities. The task of implementing the new urban agenda and the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement are a challenge not only for national governments, especially for municipalities and local governments that are now faced with the need to develop concrete strategies to achieve, for instance, the SDGs on a local level. In order to meet the principles and transformational nature of Agenda 2030, the work of GIZ in advising the programs working on these areas is on constant change. We're excited to present and discuss now in that context key questions on what is expected from current urban programs, what new capacities, whether for advisors but also for partners, are needed, how are the different goals interconnected, what are the indicators for each goal, and how to evaluate where cities stand in their implementation path. We have an exciting program to show. So the first of the presenters, Anka Derichs, will talk about localizing the SDGs, implementing the new urban agenda. Dr. Anka Derichs is a spatial planner, expert in urban development, decentralized governance, urban mobility, as well as monitoring and evaluation. She has more than 15 years of practical academic experience in Africa, the MENA region, and Germany in these fields. Now she's part of the GIZ team Policy Advice for Urban Development, which is supporting the BMZ, the German ministry in Bonn. One part of her work is the follow-up and review process of the new urban agenda, Habitat 3. The second presentation will provide some hints on how to integrate the Agenda 2030 in GIZ's advisory services. This is presented from Katharina Lampe. She's a political scientist, expert in decentralized governance and regional development. She has more than 6 years of work experience as team leader and project advisor in post-socialist and post-Soviet countries in projects of municipal development and cross-border cooperation. Since 2015, she's working as planning expert in the sectoral department Governance and Conflict, mainly dealing with questions of decentralization and municipal development in Africa. The third presentation will give us some insights on integral implementation of the new urban agenda, so experiences and contributions from Latin America. This is especially interesting for us because we're dealing with Asia and we're always looking into how to connect it. Barbara Scholz is an urban and regional planner, expert in sustainable spatial development, national urban policies, and legal frameworks, land policies, and participatory urban management in Latin America. So more than 20 years of practical and academic experience in Ecuador, Germany, Colombia, and Chile. She was part of the team advising the Ecuadorian and the German delegation in the Habitat 3 preparatory process. And since 2015, she's an advisor with the sector project Sustainable Development of Metropolitan Regions based in Bonn. So I will now hand over to Dr. Anka Derichs to give us some insights on localizing the SDGs. Kindly take over the presentation on the top.
Thank you very much, Eva. Dear colleagues, Yes, our sector program is advising the section within BMZ working on urban development, mobility and water. And this section prepared the German involvement in the Habitat 3 process together with the Ministry, the German Ministry of Environment. And it also now leads the involvement of the international follow-up concerning the development cooperation. The starting point for discussing this topic is that if mainstreaming of the new urban agenda will not be powerful, urbanization will not be sustainable, and the SDGs will not be achieved. But how to do this mainstreaming in a successful way? So localizing the SDGs and implementing the new urban agenda, on this topic, I would like to offer you food for discussion along 4 topics. The one is there is a legacy for the local level now of intensive global agenda building during the past 2 years. The second topic is what guidance does the new urban agenda give within this jungle of international global agendas? And what are, thirdly, the next steps towards implementing the new urban agenda? And fourthly, I would like to give a brief oversight on what, in how far German development cooperation might change in the urban field. I have added an annexure, which I will not present today because of time. However, it gives you some information on localizing the SDGs, current publications that are available, and events, for example, on national urban policies, and follow-up and review of the new urban agenda. So the recent years have seen the emergence of numerous remarkable global agendas. All are considered relevant for the local or city level actors. For example, the SDGs, beyond the goal 11, which is directly relevant to cities, the majority of the SDGs cannot be achieved without decisive action by local governments. Also, the Paris Agreement, to limit temperature rise to less than 2 degrees and curb emissions, they all actions in there require action at the city level. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda Financing for Development also recognizes the need to support local governments in securing these resources to achieve the SDGs and sustainable development. So all of the global agendas are universal in a sense that they overcome traditional divisions between developed and developing nations, and some do this for the first time. And this fact opens up the opportunity for more horizontal learning at the city level, building on existing networks and processes in response to the top-down global agendas. So in my view, this renews and strengthens the mandate of city-to-city networks. However, from the perspective of local level actors, these agenda processes have created an ambivalent outcome. Because although all global agendas recognize the increased importance of the local level and of local governance, they all fail to make precise commitments towards improving the enabling conditions. For example, the mandates, the capacities, the resources and partnerships. I see that Barbara has problems reading the presentation, but I'm sure you're fixing that. Otherwise, please let me know if there's a problem with the presentation. So all these agendas do not define clear action plans, particularly also for the local level. And the language remains mostly kind of aspirational and does not specify how goals will be realized, by whom or how this would be funded. Also, generally, the global agenda processes have exposed limits of what can be achieved in the current UN system, which is based on negotiations with national governments that do not always adequately represent priorities of the local level. In their own countries, for example, there are conflicts concerning subsidiarity. And lastly, although the global agendas complement each other in principle, linkages, intersections, and interdependencies are often not explicitly developed. So as a result, we are now confronted with a maze of agendas that is hard to comprehend, particularly for the local city actors or local level actors who also need to work at the same time with nationally and locally relevant agendas. So does the new urban agenda help? And gives guidance in this process. The new urban agenda is the outcome document of the third United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Development, Urban Development. It took place in Quito last year in 2016 in Quito in Ecuador. This summit takes place every 20 years. And last year, about 30,000 participants visited Quito and the conference. 10,000 of them were international from 167 countries. There were no heads of states present, or 5 at least, but it was more on the ministers level. About 53 ministers were there from different countries. And it was the highest participation of civil society that an UN conference ever had. And at the same time, a World Mayor Assembly took place in Quito and beforehand, before the conference in Bogota. So the famous picture of the Habitat 3 that you saw on the previous slide was actually the World Mayor Assembly. So all the member states and all the participants came together to commit themselves to better plan, manage, and live in cities, and to create livable cities for all. On the pictures you see, it was a typical UN conference with plenary sessions where the major groups, the stakeholder and member states could speak. There were over 200 networking and site events, and a huge exhibition hall, and the German pavilion was frequently visited there and very visible, with about 45 events. Now, the preparation of the UN conference took place over 2 years. There were 3 preparation conferences and also negotiations on the new urban agenda document for 2 years, where Germany was very much involved, also in the preparatory bureau of the conference, and it also held the German Habitat Forum in Berlin beforehand. And to prepare the new urban agenda, 10 policy units were created, and they also show the variety of topics that the new urban agenda covers. Now, what is good about the agenda? Key aspects from the German government's perspective are that cities are recognized as important actors for sustainable development, that they need to be empowered, and that they need better financing capacity. The new urban agenda also highlights aspects of multi-level and multi-actor governance, and particularly involving the civil society also as co-producers. Also, the aspect of integrative spatial planning was very much highlighted, and it put the people's needs in the center of the whole agenda. So all in all, the new urban agenda gives a very good guidance, or does it give a good guidance? That's the question. So the NUA provides a comprehensive vision of sustainable urban development in the 21st century, and all the topics that you saw from the policy units beforehand, all are in there, and there's not much left out. However, the NUA is not an implementation-oriented instrument. It was expected to be action-oriented, particularly for implementing the 2030 agenda in and with cities. But the NUA failed to provide this. And now the successful implementation of the agenda will depend on the member states, on their initiatives and their commitments of the national governments. One good thing about the new urban agenda is that in the beginning it defines 4 so-called fundamental drivers of change for implementing the new urban agenda, which gives a bit of an action orientation. And that is countries need to work on national urban policies, also to enable sustainable urbanization process, which takes place at a very, very high speed currently. It puts the aspect of urban governance in the forefront, highlights urban and territorial development. For example, the guidelines of UN Habitat on territorial development and also on decentralization were acknowledged by all member states, which is new. And it highlights sustainable financial frameworks and instruments. Without building capacities in these fields, the new urban agenda will not be implemented, and as well the SDGs in cities. So the critical points from the German perspectives are that there is a lack of concrete agreements, like I said before. Also, while aspects of subsidiarity have been acknowledged, there are still unclear formulations in the document. The link to the SDGs is only on a very abstract layer in the 2030 agenda. From a German perspective, the 20-year cycle is much too long. There was the hope that the next summit would take place after 10 years at least, in order to give justice to the very fast urbanization process that the world is facing right now. Also, the speed of urbanization is not highlighted in the document adequately in our point of view. And so far, only very little national voluntary commitments have been made. Now, how to link the new urban agenda and the 2030 agenda? Like I said, it lacks clear statements on what mandates need to be built up or empowered, what capacities need to be built up at the local level in order to implement the different SDGs. What kind of data needs to be produced by the local level, or for which data needs the local level access to from national governments, and also the financial aspects are not laid out. The closest link still is to SDG 11 for sustainable cities and communities, and here in 2018 there will be the report to the high-level political forum monitoring the 2030 agenda on SDG 11, and UN Habitat is coordinating this report and is doing that, of course, in close consideration of the new urban agenda. So, what are the next steps? It has been agreed in the NUA that there's a 4-year reporting cycle. UN Habitat is responsible for that. It is not clear yet how a policy science interface will be facilitated. Also, the mandate of UN Habitat right now is under review. Also, the Details for the follow-up and review process will be clarified during this year by the UN General Assembly. There needs to be a UN-wide cooperation on urbanization, and it's still unclear how this is taking place. UN Habitat will play a crucial role in that. UN Habitat will also publish guidelines or an action framework for national governments. It is expected to bring these out in the mid of this year. And very crucial for the follow-up and review process for the NUA will be the World Urban Forum in Kuala Lumpur, if it takes place there in 2018. This forum will also be the main place for stakeholder participation. Now, lastly, what changes can we foresee in the German Development Cooperation now that the NUA is there? Well, nothing is cast in stone, but right now the BMZ revises the sector strategy on sustainable urban development. It already decided upon crucial topics, and the aim is to publish the sector strategy before the German government elections in autumn this year. The German government launched the Transformative Urban Transport Initiative in Kino. This is also the national commitment of Germany to Habitat 3. Some new topics or also old topics that needs to be further mainstreamed within the regional sections of BMZ, for example, on national urban policies and to build capacities for better urban governance, and also housing as a new topic. The BMZ is in the process of mainstreaming these right now, but we don't know in how far this will affect development cooperation within the next 5 years, for example. Crucial, or it's highlighted that peer-to-peer learning among cities becomes as what should be promoted. Germany wants to stay involved in the follow-up and review of the global agendas in and with cities. And here in this case, the local agenda 2030 is always seen as key. So it's about localizing SDGs. And the Environment Ministry is also increasing their urban programs under the International Climate Protection Initiative. However, BMZ is always arguing and saying the demand needs to be articulated by partner countries. And this is why, let me go this, I would like to pose also the 2 questions to this group here, that what are the capacity needs in your countries for tracking the SDGs in the newer in and with cities, and what are the partner demands? Would be very interesting for me to hear about that. And lastly, I would like to make an announcement. Please vote for our project in the GIZ Innovation Fund, Localizing the SDGs, where we offer an app as a starter kit where citizens can give their perceptions in how far life in their city has been improved. And please have a look after this at the annexure, and should there be any questions on this content, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anka. This is excellent. I haven't seen the app, so I will definitely have a look at it. It might be useful also for cities. So, yeah, any kind of questions you can also raise in the chat, but I would like to have, yeah, a really interactive discussions at the end. So I will now welcome Katharina Lampe to give us some hints on how to integrate the Agenda 2030 in GIZ services. So kindly take over as a presenter on the top. I think your microphone is still mute. I try to unmute. Now, perfect.
Sorry.
Perfect. Now.
I took over the presentation but forgot the microphone. Thank you very much for the invitation to your webinar, and thank you, Anka, for the presentation. And I already voted for the app. I wish you a lot of success in the competition.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I hope that my presentation in the next 15 minutes will bring up some new ideas how to integrate as advisors in project the principles and the ideas of the Agenda 2030, and also give you new ideas how to discuss the Agenda 2030 with your partners. Actually, when the Agenda 2030 was ratified in autumn 2015, we had a lot of questions as planning experts in the planning division. We were asking ourselves, okay, is this now same, but different? What is new? And we also asked ourselves how to deal with the complexity of the Agenda 2030. Because I think you are also aware, and Anka already presented the different goals, the 17 goals, and there are much more sub-targets. And yes, this was a very huge difference compared to the Millennium Development Goals. And at the same time, as planning officers here in the headquarters, we realized that our commissioning ministry already started with the implementation. I think you also got to know this initiative program, Agenda 2030 last year. And also our partners started to ask the projects how to react to the agenda and how to start implementation. And we got a lot of questions from our colleagues from the projects abroad, and they asked for methodological advice. So in our division, we started a discussion and asked ourselves which implications will the agenda have for our work in the field of governance and conflict. So we, as a result of this discussion last year, we developed a guidance for first target group planning advisors, but we try now to see if this guidance could also be useful for advisors and projects. Teresa has just sent the document to you some minutes before the session started, and I would like to ask you, maybe after the session, unfortunately it's only in German, but maybe to open and to have a look. It's for digital use, and you can click on the icons which you see on the top, and then you jump into the different chapters of the it was Lucy in the different chapters of the guidance. And the main idea of this guidance is also to give you a lot of hyperlinks and which guide you to other information. For example, homepages or also tools of GIZ which help you to understand dimensions of the agenda, or tools to better structure your advice for the partners. In this presentation, I have taken some aspects out of this guidance. Yes, because it's in German, and the webinar is in English, so I could not go really into the document. So I structured the presentation in 3 steps. And I think as planning officers, we have asked ourselves first, how do we contribute with our sector to the implementation of the Agenda 2030? And we wanted to demonstrate how our work helps to reach the goals of the agenda. And this is exactly what Anka also demonstrated for the urban field, and the responsibility of local actors to reach the goals of the agenda. I think UCLG, for example, did also a very good publication on that. And I just wanted to present you here very briefly this beautiful SDG wheel for the mining sector. This was done during a mission in project evaluation and development mission in Chile. And here the colleagues showed how the advisory services in the mining sector contribute to the fulfillment of the goals of the agenda, and then what the program is doing, and like the approach of the program to fulfill the SDGs. Yes, this was the first step, and I think it was extremely important for us to show the relevance of a certain topic, and at the same time we came to the conclusion that the idea of the Agenda 2030 is more far-reaching. And an important idea of the agenda is to break silos and to go beyond a sectoral understanding of the world. And with this picture here, I wanted to show that if we stay with our sectoral approach, this will always be a very restricted perception of the world, and maybe more important, that we will not understand each other if people from the water sector speak to people of the governance sector, but we always have our specific sector perspective on the world. So we did another step, like step 2, and this is described in the guidance as well. This is, we wanted to approach the country and ask and do like a readiness check, we call it. And we said, as planning experts, we need to know more about the status of implementation in of the Agenda 2030 in a certain country or a region, and this is very important for us to design an adequate advisory approach for the country, and and to develop a strategy and for a project, or to redirect maybe also a project. And we see here 3 entry points which help us to understand the status of the country, the readiness. First, there is the monitoring and review process. And for the Agenda 2030, as Anka already said, this monitoring and review process is crucial and exists at the regional, national, and global level. And it's very much focused on learning. This I find quite interesting, with a high-level political fora, and there is not yet for all the reports a defined structure. So countries are also exploring how to present their progress of the implementation of the Agenda 2030. But those reports help us as planning experts to understand the priorities of the country, the strategy and the commitment. And I have integrated here a link to the UN Sustainable Development Knowledge Platform. And maybe later you can go on this homepage and search for your country. And there you find like very important information. When will be the next reporting date for your country on the high-level political forum? Who is the focal point in your country for the Agenda 2030? Which reports are already available online for the Agenda 2030? The second entry point for us are the indicators. Of course, they are important for planning officers because we want to establish a certain coherence of the indicator set of a project with the agenda indicators. For you, I find it interesting to see here again this aspect of learning, because it's important to know that not all the indicators are already finalized. There are different so-called tiers of indicators, and some are already finalized and some are still under discussion. So there is discussion ongoing, especially also for the goal 16, which is interesting for us, how we measure that institutions are inclusive, for example. I find this interesting. First, it's a little bit annoying because you don't have something fixed and you can already start measuring, but I think this dialogue is quite important in this interagency expert group, which is responsible for the formulation of the indicators. Interesting for you as well is I integrated here another hyperlink. There are initiatives which have done a very rough SDG fitness tests of countries or regions. I integrated here, and we have put it in the guidance as well, the SDG index and dashboard. And I think this gives you and gives us as planning officers a good basis to start a discussion with our partners on potential challenges in the country linked to the Agenda 2030. And finally, as planning experts, and I think this is the same for you as advisors, we never have the perfect answers, but we should always ask the right questions. So we have in our guidance developed key questions for the readiness check. And yes, and this is, for example, in this case, which steering structures exist in the partner countries for implementation and monitoring, which actors are relevant for the implementation and monitoring, which political priorities are on the agenda of the partner country, has the Agenda 2030 been integrated into the national development strategy? So this is all in like this work aid or guidance. And for us, we also came to the conclusion that a very important dimension of the agenda are the principles, because they really help us to think out of these sectoral perspectives or silos. And therefore, in the end of the presentation, I would shortly introduce you to these 5 principles and to give some practical project examples, really only like very, very shortly. And in the guidance for the Agenda 2030, which we developed, we not only describe the principles and give a project example, but we also develop key questions again. What should we discuss with our partners in the countries to understand possible interventions to work on the principles? And exactly these key questions and tools and other working aids which are existing in the intranet, which will give us more information on the principles. this is what we provide you with in this guidance. Yeah, but here I just want briefly to go through the principles. Yes, the principles. Actually, what is a little bit difficult with the principles is that they are not explicitly written in the documents of the Agenda 2030. And there was in the last year a lot of discussion in GIZ, but also within the international community about the exact formulation of the principles. And there has been now an agreement in the GIZ on the formulation of the 5 principles and what GIZ understands by universality, integrate 3 dimensions of sustainability, monitoring and review, leave no one behind, and shared responsibility. I hope I explain it right. Marius, my colleague from the sector project Agenda 2030, you can add or correct me, please, if I understood something wrong. I want to start with universality, and Anka already underlined this aspect in her presentation. This principle follows the idea that the agenda is a guiding document for all countries worldwide. You know maybe that Germany has adapted the sustainability strategy to the Agenda 2030 in the end of 2016. And so there is this idea that all countries are developing countries. And I think that there are already wonderful examples, especially in the urban field, like the urban networks Anka mentioned. And these networks incorporate the idea of learning on eye level, and that cities all over the world can learn from each other to solve problems and challenges for urban development. And there is this Connective Cities project that you might know in GIZ, which is running already for some years. Second, there is the principle to integrate the three dimension of sustainability in our advisory approach, the social, economic, and environmental dimensions. And I think from the urban perspective, this is very well reflected in the approach of integrated urban development. The idea behind is that we support our partners to discuss the trade-offs between the social, economic, and environmental dimensions and find a consensus. On the other hand, it's also what we see, like there is a need also of intersectoral cooperation, also between the German portfolio, and to use synergies. There is a very good example in Nepal, which there has been a project development mission some months ago, and all the programs from energy, economic development, local development, etc., they met and discussed how they can use synergies to contribute better to the fulfillment of the goals. So I think there are a lot of new perspectives, new approaches that we can pilot. Third is the monitoring and review process. Anka also mentioned this aspect. And there is a question, which role do cities play in the monitoring and review process? There is a very interesting approach in Ghana, and I see that Lennart is also part of this webinar. Maybe you can add some more information later. But in Ghana, there has been the national strategy has been or is about to be adapted, and according to the Agenda 2030, and priorities have been set. And now there is this idea to trickle down the priorities from the national level to the local level, and to integrate those priorities in the development planning on the district level, and also use the planning and the monitoring on the district level for the monitoring and review process on the national level for the Agenda 2030. Yes, there is 1 minute left. I think it's fine. There is Leave No One Behind as a principle, which puts a specific focus on marginalized groups in a society. And for us, there is the question from the perspective of municipalities, how they can reach vulnerable groups. I think there are some good examples also in the field of slum upgrading in the urban field. And there is one project at the moment under development in Serbia, which, with the question how to provide municipal services, especially for vulnerable groups. And this demands a more careful analysis of target groups, I think, from us planning officers and the projects. Finally, the shared responsibility, the multi-actor partnership, which follows the idea that no problem in society can be solved only by one actor, and focus on the synergy and cooperation between civil society, private actors, and public actors. I don't have a very good example from the governance field or the local governance field for international multi-actor partnership. Maybe you have. But in the economic development sector, there is the sectoral project Sustainability in Textile Supply Chain, which is discussing among public actors, civil society, and private sector about standards, quality standards and social standards in the textile industry. So, yes, coming back to the initial questions that planning officer had in the beginning, what is new and same, again, at Agenda 2030, same but different. I would say that, like, you as project advisors and we as planning experts, we can build on a long-standing experience. The Agenda 2030 is also strengthening the German advisory approach with the multi-level approach, the central aspect of learning and also learning on eye level, the intersectoral approach. But we think that it's a good opportunity, a good window of opportunity to discuss questions linked to the principles, to readjust our advisory services, and to also to explore new paths with our partners. So this is the end of the presentation, and I hope you will have a look on the guidance that we developed, and I would be very happy to get your feedback, actually, and a good project and like recommendations, which project ideas we should integrate when we update the guidance.
Thank you very much, Katharina. The first aid kit, the guidance has already been shared with you. Yeah. So I think it's really interesting, and also to screen in the project examples. So let us go to to Latin America, and now the integral implementation of the new urban agenda of Barbara Scholz. Kindly take over as a presenter. And unmute your phone.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share the experiences from Latin America. Of course, these are not experiences regarding the implementation of the new urban agenda, but taking a bit the words of my colleagues Anka and Katharina. The aim of this publication was to show, on one hand, the needs and capacities of local governments in implementing international agendas, but on the other hand, also the long-standing experiences we have already in these countries, and to learn from it in order to better to improve our own performance as a cooperation agency. So this study was the result of an initiative of both sector networks in Latin America, working the one about good governance issues and the other one about environment and rural development. Maybe for you in TurboClick it's nothing new, but for Latin America it was something new to have joint work streams, and in this case related to Habitat 3 and the possibilities of developing an integrated approach on the implementation of the new urban agenda and of the climate agenda. So maybe one first chapter would be interesting for you in Asia as well. The study starts with a recapitulation of the challenges of urban development in Latin America, based in the majority of the points on CEPAL, on the UN Agency of Economic Development in the region, in the Latin American and Caribbean region. And the result was first many things that you probably know. 18% have a very high degree of urbanization in Latin America. 18% of the population are now urban, and growing importance of metropolitan regions or city rural regions. Second, a very important new focus on middle-sized cities that are growing, really growing cities in Latin America, not so much the mega cities, but the middle-sized cities. The third point, poverty and inequality, that on one hand we have less urban poor in Latin America, but still every fourth is a slum dweller. A fourth point, very important, economy and employment. The challenge of urban development. On one hand, 50% of the regional GDP are produced in the cities, but on the other hand, we have a high degree of informality and low productivity. The fifth point, weak communal finances and high need for investment. Very low communal revenues, high dependency of financial transfers from the central government, and a very high need for infrastructural investment. And the last point, climate change and natural disasters that are affecting a more and more urban population. The case study, the publication is based on 5 case studies focused on middle-sized cities and regional representativity, and the focus for the selection of the cases was on spatial and sectorial integration, on certain principles for integrated strategies and interventions that are resumed here: spatial and sectorial integration, multi-level approach, and participation. And the third point, analyzing the factors of success for implementation. So, what was the role of political and legal framework, of instruments, processes, and funding, of institutional capacity, civic and stakeholder participation for the success of the strategy. The 5 cases selected was for on one hand, La Paz in Mexico. There the entry point was resilience and preventive risk management. The second one was Bucaramanga in Colombia. There the subject was housing supply, the strategies regarding housing supply, regulation of informal settlements. In Cuenca, Ecuador, the main point was the sustainable management of water resources. In Santiago, Providencia, the point was the new strategies of participative planning and the containment of land speculation. And the last one was Belo Horizonte in Brazil regarding sustainable and inclusive mobility. I selected 3 cases to get a bit more into details. I hope there is enough time. First, in the case of Bucaramanga, it's a middle-sized city, but part of a metropolitan region. What was the integrated approach there in that case? And the housing supply or the strategy regarding housing and regulation of informal settlement was connected with strategies for risk management, because in general, these informal settlements, or often these informal settlements, are in risk-prone areas. So the integrated approach was aimed on connecting both strategies. The lessons learned here, what I would like to point out is first, the importance of the metropolitan region. Bucaramanga is part of a metropolitan region, and there are institutional arrangements and a legal and political framework for the functioning of this metropolitan region. And in this case, for an integrated approach and the successful implementation of this integrated approach, the existence of this governance mechanism of the metropolitan region were key. The second point, the management instruments. In Colombia, we have a long experience with different kinds of planning instruments. In this case, the connection between public habitat and housing policies and land use planning, and both as part of the integrated metropolitan development plan. Lastly, the financing instruments that were linked with participative urbanistic and institutional governance. Maybe you know the experience of Porto Alegre with the participatory budget planning, and they adapted this kind of mechanisms to develop new financing instruments for urban and housing planning. This was the case of Bucaramanga. Maybe interesting to point out that the issue of metropolitan governance structures is very important now in Latin America. Belo Horizonte is the second example. I would like to point out Belo Horizonte is also part of a metropolitan region. It was constituted quite a long time ago, in 1973. And there the integrated approach was targeted towards connecting social inclusion and sustainable mobility. So that's what Katharina said, or I think Anka said it as well, that the international agenda now is addressing very strongly the silo thinking or containing the silo, changing the silo thinking, and in this case, it was a clear approach on connecting both things, social inclusion and sustainable mobility. In this case, the important point was that the sectorial policy regarding mobility planning and implementing had to be adjusted to a new general urban law that was based on the concept of the right to the city. So the social inclusion was key and the most important point of starting point for a sectorial policy that forced the metropolitan government on including or adjusting the sectorial policies on the social inclusion targets. Maybe one point that is interesting for you as well, almost all of these cases that were studied in this publication had observatory systems or something you could call it participatory mechanisms of monitoring and review that are part of the planning processes and implementation processes of public policies. and they are working in that cities and are something like a routine in local governance in Latin America. The third case is Cuenca. Cuenca is a typical middle-sized city, not part of a metropolitan region. Here, the integrated approach was oriented to the sustainable management of water resources. And the element I would like to point out here is the importance of municipal service suppliers or providers that are working independent in a certain way with a very technical approach, with a long-term perspective. And not in every city, this is still not a real routine and present situation in Latin American local government. And sometimes we forget the necessity of capacity building in that kind of institutional arrangement, this kind of municipal service providers. And the other interesting point in that case was that this municipal service provider working on water sanitation and solid waste management also has the competence of administrating the national park. And this national park is Cajas, is very important because there we have the water, oh, how do you call that? The water fund, no, I don't know. And this, for the administration of this national park, they have the water fund, PONAPA, that works with the rural communities and the regional energy suppliers. So it's a very important point of a starting point for intersectorial and intergovernmental cooperation. The recommendations of this study, first, acknowledgement of the importance of comprehensive political and legal framework as a necessary condition for long-term targets like climate protection, social cohesion, and equal living conditions. So this is an important point in the context of the international agendas that were presented by my colleagues. Second, the principle of subsidiarity, maybe more than decentralization, using potentials of city regional governance structure. This was a very important result in the case of Latin America. Third, to reestablish the regulating functions of governmental entities. So the whole point of governmental regulation of market processes that are dominating urban development, and to connect planning instruments, land use planning instruments with budget planning, and planning with implementation, supervision, and also the possibility of sanctions. Third, to enable the access to funding, and there we have an important action field in the field of fiscal policies and mechanisms that can compensate the disparities of revenues of local fiscal policy. The last one, civic participation, the different practices or good practices of participatory roundtables and urban observatories for planning and monitoring. The last point, this one, process-orientated planning and management of urban development. This is quite important because in Latin America, in many countries, we have quite differentiated legal framework with a lot of instruments and a lot of experience also in implementing these instruments. But it is still a very, the focus is still very addressing very much normative instruments, to generate norms and regulations, but not so much on implementing them in a dialogue process that is capable to include different stakeholders and actors, and that is one of the results of the study as well. Technical recommendations were also formulated, high quality urban habitat, not only to see housing, for instance, separated from habitat policies, regional urban planning as the general framework for urban development, mobility and city regional integration may be one of the important points. Mobility structures as an important key for integrating city regional linkages. Urban material cycles, resource management and resilience as a basis or an aim of every planning process in the urban development area, and data and monitoring, especially the disaggregated data collection and analysis, so that you really can use them for the needs of urban development. I think with that I can finish. Here we have the links to both studies. One, we have it in Spanish and in English. And in the introduction, the English version is a bit shorter, not so in detail like as the Spanish one. Thank you.